just ask at least is if some of you who are toward the back, if you'd like to kind of scooch up, if you don't mind, just to stand up and just come up forward a couple of rows or two, just we'll kind of get a little closer together. Would you mind doing that, just to come a little closer to the front? If we're all together, we'll be warmer, if nothing else. Ralph, how about it? Come on. Hopefully that makes us a little cozier. And I thought I saw Margie come in here, but I don't see her right now. Can you hear okay, Wayne? Good. That's good. We're doing good then. I'd like to today share a message with you from a verse that's found in Luke chapter 18. And I realize that Nathan is teaching through the book of Luke, and he's going to get to Luke 18 in just 2 or 3 weeks probably. So I don't mean to steal any thunder from what he's going to say, because I'm sure he'll have some interesting and thought-provoking things for us in Luke chapter 18. But I just really want to focus this morning on half of one verse, actually. But just to give the backdrop, the first few verses of Luke chapter 18, Jesus is telling a parable. And the parable that he's telling, there's a judge who really doesn't care what anybody thinks. And there's a woman, a widow, who has a grievance. Back then they didn't have prosecuting attorneys or whatever. You just went directly to the judge. And so she had a grievance. It doesn't say what it was, but she kept coming back to this judge to try to get some justice for this grievance that she had, and kept persisting. And finally, even though the judge didn't care what anybody thought, he finally granted her some justice. And at the end of that, Jesus says, if you know that, he said, if you can imagine then that the God of the universe, your creator and your father, is certainly going to bring justice for all of us who may have suffered wrongs. He's going to make right all the wrongs, and he'll do it in a fashion that'll seem quick enough, even though at the time it may seem like we're waiting and having to deliberate, and it seems like it's a long time before justice comes. But then anyhow, at the end of that parable, he says at the very last part of it, he's telling about God. He says, I tell you, he will avenge them speedily. But he says, nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on earth? He actually ends the parable with a question. And I don't believe the question is a question just for the disciples that he was speaking to, or the Jews, that other folks that may have heard that message. I think when he says, when the Son of Man cometh, he changed the whole scope of what he's talking about. And it's a question that he has that's for you and for me today, and for all Christians who've lived through all time since that time. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Clearly, when he comes, he's looking for something. Now, I'll confess to you that I'm really not, I would not profess to be an expert on eschatology, the study of last things. The only thing I've heard lots of ideas and thoughts and opinions that people have, and I've seen people that used to draw, back in the 80s, they used to draw all kinds of maps and arrows, and this is going to happen and this, and so forth. And frankly, I didn't ever believe most of that stuff. But, because I don't understand all that, I'll confess. But here's what I do know, is that Jesus is coming again. That much I know. The exact details, he gave a lot of signs that you'd see before that, but a lot of those you could kind of pick almost any time, and they could have been fulfilled. So he made it clear, in fact, that we wouldn't know exactly when he was coming. The one thing that I remember back in about 1980, sometimes you can be reading through the Bible, and a passage that you've never really paid much attention to, all of a sudden it just kind of seems to leap off the page, and it hits you between the eyes. And so I had that happen to me back in 1980 with a verse over in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. It says, "But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." One of the things that you can tell when it's getting closer, at least, to the end, is that there's going to be a rapid increase in the amount of transportation and a rapid increase in knowledge. And if you look from the time of, certainly Daniel was several hundred years before Christ, but even from the time of Christ, that he was here on earth, you can see that humanity went along for hundreds of years, and any sort of progress in the areas of transportation or knowledge were relatively slow. You could go all the way up to 1800 years after Christ was born, and people were still traveling pretty much the same way as they were when Jesus was on the earth. But since in the last couple hundred years or so, things have changed, and you can see in most of our lifetimes, things have changed even more rapidly. I saw, this is just from a passing statistic. United States Department of Transportation said that in 2016, the year before last, that there were 660 million people who boarded a plane in the United States for among the major air carriers. Now, I'm not sure who that, I suppose, United, Delta, American Airlines, etc. I'm not sure who all the major airlines are, or how many minor airlines there are, but just for the major airlines, whichever ones they're referring to, 660 million people got on a plane the year before last. That's a lot of people traveling around. And that's just planes. That doesn't count how many people are driving and going in buses and trucks, big over-the-road trucks and trains and ships and so forth, right? We believe there's more people traveling all over the place, constantly traveling than ever before. And it's easier to do. And knowledge, of course, is increasing. So those, again, don't know when Jesus is going to come, but we can rest assured that we're closer than ever before. It's getting closer every day, isn't it? And it could, it could come. He could come. The point is not when he comes. That's not the question we need to ask. We don't need to worry about when he's going to come. The point of this and of what Jesus is saying is, the point is that he's going to come looking for something. He's coming looking for something. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth, he says. He's looking for faith. That's really what he's looking for among us. And so a couple of weeks, well, actually 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks ago today, my youngest daughter was in the process of finishing up a lengthy period of labor before she had a baby Sunday morning, her first. And I'm sure all of you are aware of that because we publicized that. But I know that on that particular Sunday morning, between the hours, I was awake about 3:30 that morning. I wasn't there where she was in the room. Donna was, but was with our daughter, but I was at home. But anyhow, I was awake at 3:30, and I was praying from 3:30 until 6:30 in the morning, specifically for her and for her baby. I knew she was in labor, didn't know what was going on exactly, but I just knew that was the time to pray. And in the course of that prayer time, one of the things that I felt like God impressed upon me was a couple of thoughts from the scriptures that I went and looked up later and found the verses that I think go with that. And so that's what I want to share with you today, is some thoughts, because they have to do with faith. They have to do with faith. And the first one I want to share with you is from Matthew 17, verse 20. In Matthew chapter 17, Jesus had been up to what we refer to as the Mount of Transfiguration, James, Peter, and John. And he comes back down from the mountain there, and immediately he's accosted by a man who has a son. He says, look, I've got a problem. To Jesus he says, I've got a problem because my son throws himself in the fire, and he just does all sorts of erratic things, some things that some people today might say are reflective of a seizure disorder, but whatever all it amounted to, I don't know, but he was doing some things that were unpredictable and erratic and were harming himself. And they were clear that there was a demonic involvement in this. But he said, I went to your disciples and they couldn't cast the demon out of this thing, out of my son. And Jesus expressed a little frustration with his disciples at that point, but then he said, bring the boy to me. And so the man brought his son in, and Jesus cast a demon out of him. And as soon as he had done that, his disciples came over to him and they said, well, Lord, why couldn't we cast this demon out? And Jesus, the first thing that he says to them, and Jesus said to them, because of your unbelief. Now let me back up for just 1 second. Over in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 1, what you'll see is that there was a time when Jesus, was sending his disciples out. He sent them out 2 at a time. There was 2 different times. One time he sent out 12, and then another time he sent out 70. But whenever he sent out his disciples to go out into the little villages to preach and to teach and to heal people and so forth, it says he gave them the power to cast out demons. Isn't that right? You've seen that in that verse. Now what's interesting is you can come back and look at everything else that you can find that I've ever seen, at least in the Bible. You can go back and look at that. After that time, Jesus didn't ever take that authority or that power away from him. He didn't. There's no place that it says it, at least. There's no place that says that they came back and he said, well, okay, King Zexel, now you don't have that power anymore. It doesn't say that. And so they still had that same authority, that same power that he had given them. Which is an interesting thought when you think about it for a second. The Bible says over in Romans chapter 11, it says the gifts and the callings of God are without repentance. Another way of saying that, that's the old King James way of saying it, but another way of saying it is to say that it's irrevocable. Do you know when God gives you a gift, you got it. When he gives you a gift, if God has given you a gift, and you at any point in time in your life, if he's given you a gift and you don't have it today, it's not because he took it back. He didn't take it back. When he gives you a gift, he means for you to have it. So Jesus had given them a gift, but for some reason they were no longer able to do it. And he says, well, it's because of your unbelief. It says the lack of faith in some versions. It's interesting, the unbelief is kind of a better fit in some ways, because the word in the Greek, the word pistis, is the word for faith. And in the Greek language, whenever they want to say something, a negative, they just have a little alpha, just one little letter. The first letter of the Greek alphabet is alpha, that they put in front of that word. And that's the word that you see in that place in Matthew chapter 17. Apistis. It means literally not faith. He said, because of your not faith, because of your unbelief, because you didn't have the faith, you couldn't do this. And he says, he says, for verily I say unto you, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you shall say to this mountain, remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible to you. Nothing. Do you know, Jesus said unbelief, it was unbelief that caused him to be unable to do this, because when there's no faith, nothing really happens. When there's no faith, nothing really changes. It takes faith for that to happen, and you say, well, that's interesting. What does it mean to have faith like a mustard seed? I don't know about you. That's one of those things that I've kind of wondered about over the years. There are two places in the Scripture where it talks about mustard seed. There's some other places, or one or two other places, where there are verses like this, where Jesus is talking, and it said, if your faith is as a grain of mustard seed. There's another place over in Matthew chapter 13. Let's see if I've got that one here. It says, another parable he put forth to them, saying, kingdom of heaven is like to a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. I think we didn't get the rest of that verse. But maybe you remember the rest of it. It says mustard seed is a small thing. It's very tiny. It grows into a big tree or bush or whatever, so that the birds of the air can land there, can land in it. So I think that's one way in the Scripture. This mustard seed is spoken of as as a parallel to the kingdom of heaven, in the sense that starts out small, doesn't look like much, becomes something great and mighty and wonderful. But I think that's a little different usage than what Jesus is talking about, your faith like a grain of mustard seed. And so I want to explore a little bit about what that really means. Because really, when you think about it, what is the demonstration of faith that comes from the seed of a plant? We're talking about plant life here. We're not animal life, not humans, not other sorts of animals. We're talking about plant life. We don't think of plants normally as having faith. We don't think of them as believing something necessarily. That's not our understanding of plants for the most part. Certainly not seeds, little bit tiny seeds. But I want to come back to that in just a second. The thing about this faith as a mustard seed, is that it enables you to speak to a mountain, and the mountain moves. The mountain has to do what you say. And I think what we really have trouble believing, let me see if I can come back for a second to this. I think what we really have trouble believing the most is the last phrase that Jesus says in here, when he says, nothing shall be impossible to you. We understand that nothing is impossible with God. All things are possible with God, right? Jesus said that too. We understand that's true. What's a little harder for us to actually get a hold of and believe is that you can have a faith such that nothing is impossible to you. But that is what he said. You know, I remember Jerry Fay, somebody here will remember this maybe, a little over 40 years ago. There was a brother who used to preach here whose name was N.E. Rhodes. And I remember one time he was preaching just like you're doing, Nathan, through the book of Luke. He was preaching through the book of Romans. And one day he got up and was talking, and he said, you know, sometimes people will say they have a problem understanding the book of Romans. You probably heard somebody, or maybe you've said it yourself. Maybe I have at times. But he says the truth is that people don't have a problem understanding the book of Romans. They have a problem believing the book of Romans. And I don't know, I guess that one kind of hit me between the eyes at the time, because I remembered it for 40 plus years, I think, that this is what our real problem is. You see, it's not conceptual or intellectual or because we're not smart enough or something. It's that sometimes we just have trouble believing something that's right there in the Bible in front of us. Jesus said, if you have this kind of faith as a mustard seed, nothing is impossible to you. Now, that's what he said. Right there. What do we do with that? What do we do with it? So, and you know, it's interesting, as I mentioned before, that mustard seed is it's a little thing. But Jesus didn't ever say, if you have just a little faith like a mustard seed. You know, one time when I was growing up, I lived in Kansas City. And I remember before I would go to school in the morning, I would be listening to the radio and listening to music. And up in Kansas City, some of you may be familiar with this. There's a community of people who are believers of some sort. Something that they've developed a community up there. It's actually out in Lee Summit on the east side of Kansas City called Unity Village. Anybody here ever heard of Unity Village? Maybe you've heard of it. Maybe not. Anyhow, they used to have back in those days. They'd have a little 1 or 2 minute sort of a word of inspiration or word of encouragement that they would bring on the radio. And I just remember, so you'd hear this if you were listening to the radio, it would just come on, you'd have to hear it. So, and I remember one day, the guy who was speaking these, it sounded real, he just sounded real pious and holy to me at the time. I was 16 or 17 years old. And I didn't know very much. I know I don't know very much even so now, but I knew even less than that, if you can believe that. It's true. At any rate, this gentleman came on and he said, he was talking about faith, and he said and he was talking about the mustard seed, and he said, and I'm not kidding, he said, if you have just a little faith, you can remove mountains. And immediately, it's just funny, because right then I knew that I could never believe what that guy was saying. Because what it says, because actually that's not what it says in the Bible. Let me come down to another, what does it say in 1 Corinthians 13? I didn't know much, but I knew 1 Corinthians 13. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have how much faith? All faith. It doesn't say little faith. If you just have a little faith, you can know. So that I have all faith and can remove mountains. See, that's what it takes to move. That's what it takes to move the mountains. It takes everything. It takes all faith, not just a little. But Jesus has called us to have all faith, I believe. I think that's what he's saying to us, because he's talking about that mustard seed that we can move mountains. So let me come a little further with this and see if we can find another way to talk about this and think about it. In Matthew chapter 20, Jesus is in the last week or so of his life. And he's going from one place to another. He was traveling, and it says he was a little hungry. And he saw a fig tree. So he thought, I'll stop and get a fig off this fig tree. I'm hungry. And he went, you remember the story? And there weren't any figs on that tree. It was out there by itself, I guess, is what it is. Because I think fig trees are, what is it they call those kind of trees? Oh, they've got to have two of them. They've got to cross-pollinate. They won't have fruit if they don't cross-pollinate. That's just the way that works. Out there by the, somehow this was a fig tree out by itself, but it had no fruit. Nothing on it. And so Jesus actually spoke a curse on that tree. It said, you're never going to have fruit again. And a little bit later, the disciples noticed this. I don't know if it was right at that moment or if it was a little bit later, but the disciples noticed this tree just up and died. I mean, that was the last day of life for that tree. That tree was just gone, wilted. And they marveled at that, and Jesus answered, and he said to them, verily I say unto you, if you have faith and doubt not, you shall not only do this which is done to the fig tree, but also, it gets a little familiar again, if you say unto this mountain, be thou removed and be cast into the sea, it shall be done. Well, that sounds familiar. But let me come back for a second. Jesus said, he didn't mention the mustard seed here, but he did say this, if you have faith and doubt not doubt, no doubt in it. What does it mean to have all faith? It means there's not any doubt. There's no doubt about it. And that's important. Why? It's important because to doubt means to hesitate. Do I want to go this way? Do I want to go this way? I don't know. I might go one way, I might go the other. I just don't know which one I should do. That's what doubt is about. It's about hesitation. Hesitation. And it's interesting, the word in the Greek that's used in this verse right here, where he says, if you have faith and doubt not, is found in another place. It's found over in James chapter 1. In James chapter 1, it says in the Bible, if any one of you lacks wisdom, anybody that lacks wisdom, he says, let him ask of God, that gives to all men liberally and upbraideth not. He's not going to get on to you. Where's the source of wisdom? God. God is the source of wisdom. Yeah, if you don't have enough wisdom, feel like I don't understand what to do, I need some more wisdom, you can ask God. It says, and he's glad to give it to you. He'd love to give it to you generously, overflowing. He's not going to get mad at you or criticize you because you weren't smart enough or didn't have enough wisdom on your own. He's glad to give it to you, right? But there's just one little contingency. One little contingency. Let me get to it here. It says, but let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. The word wavering in the Greek is the same word that was over there where Jesus said, if you have faith and doubt not. The word wavering is the same word as doubt in the Greek. Make sense? Wavering. I don't know which way I'm going to go. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth, same word again, that's used for doubt, is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. You ever sat and watched the ocean? Somebody, you can't see it from here, but if you go to the ocean, you watch those waves and they just kind of go back and forth and back and forth. You know? That's what they do. That's what it's like. Just like a wave of the sea, he said. But then he goes on to say, and I didn't put this on the screen, but then he goes on to say, for let not, this is the serious part, he says, for let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. So he's saying basically, if you need something, you need to ask God. He's glad to give it to you, but wait. You need to ask in faith. Don't doubt, don't waver, because if you waver, you're not going to receive it. And that's what he says. That's what the Bible says, right? It's right there. So there you've got it. It's interesting that here's just a way to think of this. Maybe I don't know if this is right or not. But Jesus makes a comparison. He says, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you'll talk to mountain, and mountain moved, and so forth. And then Jesus says, if you have faith and you doubt not, you can talk to the mountain, and the mountain moves. Maybe this is the only way I can really kind of understand this. Nathan, when you get to this in 2 or 3 weeks, you might have some more insights for us. But maybe the thing with that mustard seed is that mustard seed doesn't have any doubt. I don't know. It doesn't have any doubt about what it's going to become. Doesn't worry about it, I guess, a whole lot, does it? I don't know what a mustard seed does. But it doesn't have any doubt. We get plagued by doubt sometimes. And I understand that we do. All of us have had doubts, right? At one time or another about things. We do. But in fact, that's, if you think about it, that's how temptations. We've got an adversary. We do have an adversary in this world. And that's how the adversary presents temptations very often, as he starts with doubt. That's what he did with Eve. Well, did God say that? Did God say, well, so she says what he says. But then he says just the opposite. He says, no, God didn't say that. Or no, he just says, no, you won't die. You won't die. Well, it was obviously the opposite. But he starts out by trying to just bring a little doubt in there. So yeah, we're all, I think, and I think it's particularly true that young people, when they grow up and kind of leave the nest and get off on their own, they're challenged to think on their own, to believe, to know that they can't just live on their parents' beliefs. They've got to come to grips with it and believe on their own what they're going to believe. And so sometimes people do go through periods of doubt. But it's not a place to stay. It's not something to relish or to think of as a place that you want to stay, because I can't recall ever finding something. Somebody can show me this if I'm mistaken, but I don't believe I've ever seen a place in the Bible where it says, where God tells us that it's a good thing for us to have doubts. I just can't see that it even makes sense because what he said is faith. So you can see what we've said here from these verses. To receive something. The other thing I wanted to mention from I didn't have this on the screen here, but from Matthew 21 was chapter 21 was the next verse. Because the next verse, he says, after he said, if you have faith and doubt not, say the fig tree, but only the fig tree, but you can say to the mountain, be removed and be cast into the sea, and it's done. He says in verse 22, he says, in all things whatsoever you shall ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. Again, do we believe that? This is what he said, but this is just what Jesus said. In all things whatsoever you ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. Now, believing is an important word to have in there, because if you didn't believe, then there's hardly any use to prayer, is there? But all things, he says, that you ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. Again, it comes down to, are we going to really believe what Jesus has said? Are we going to believe it? The other thing I want to, one other quick thought here. When Jesus talks about having faith, he keeps mentioning mountains. You notice that? Talk to a mountain, cast a mountain into the sea, or a mountain's going to be removed, he says. Sometimes I think what we do today, I hate to say this, and maybe this is just me, maybe it's not any of you, but sometimes I think what we do today is we say, well, I don't really have any interest in where mountains are. If there's a mountain that's thrown into the sea, that's just not really relevant to me, so I don't have to worry about this. I don't have to have that kind of faith because there's not any mountains that I want to move. And I think we've missed the point when we say that, or when we think that, and I've probably thought that myself at times. I think we miss the point of what it's really about. What are the mountains? What are the mountains that he's talking about? Well, I'll mention three that have a little relevance to some of us here, right in this little group right here. When you have a daughter who's been in labor trying to have a baby for more than 40 hours, that's a mountain. It really is. And when you have a daughter who's had a baby, this is a year ago, that was a mountain. Bless God, I'm thankful to see Charlotte here this morning. And I'm telling you, when you have a sorry, Jerry, to get a little emotional here. But when you have a 4-year-old boy who's gasping for air, that's a mountain. He says, when you pray, if you pray believing, you'll receive it. Don't think that because we don't have any interest in necessarily physical mountains going somewhere. Don't think that means there are no mountains for you and for me. Sorry. Sorry about that. We have those mountains. So faith, what are we going to believe? What do we really have faith in? Do we have faith in ourselves? You know what the world tells you constantly, if you'll just believe in yourself, you can do all kinds of wonderful things. That's not true. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, that something that you hear constantly on the media, etc., but it's not true. It's not about believing in yourself. That may make you feel good for a little while, have a little self-confidence, but that's not what this is about. It's not faith in yourself. It's not faith in doctors. I'm glad we have doctors, and it's good that they can serve a useful function and have knowledge and skills. That's great. But it's not about faith in doctors. It's certainly not about faith in government leaders. We know that's true. And the place where most of us get caught up today, because the most alluring one today that there is, it's not about faith in technology. It doesn't matter whether you have smartphones or apps on the smartphones or whether you have self-driving cars or whether you have the Internet of Things that you can walk into the room and speak and the lights come on, all that kind of stuff that looks like magic. You can have all those things. But I'm telling you what, don't put your faith in that, because that faith is not gonna move a mountain. It really isn't. Those things will fail you. Those things will all fail you. But the word of the Lord stands forever. So our faith needs to be in Jesus and in the things that He's said. These are things that I've said. It's kind of hard to believe these things when He says, if you believe, if you have this faith, nothing will be impossible to you. That if you pray believing, you'll receive. But that's what He said. And we've got to hang on to that. If we don't hang on to anything else in life, we've got to hang on to what He said. Well, I'm going to stop here. I'm sorry to get all emotional about all this. I didn't really intend to or know that I would. So, but I want to invite I guess Adam's not here, so I guess you have a song or two to sing. We'll sing some songs. If you'd like to pray and want to encourage one another to have faith, Jerry, I'll be at the back. I'll probably come back there with you, Jerry. And if you'd like to pray with us, we'll be glad to pray with you. If you'd like to pray with the person standing next to you or sitting next to you, that's fine too. Because believe me, it's having the kind of faith we're talking about is something that every one of us needs to have, and we all find ourselves at times not feeling like we've really got it. But it's serious, and this is what he's looking for when he comes, right? So, Nathan, if you'll come and lead us in a song or two, or